Hello and welcome to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting. I'm Phil Emonson, and in this podcast series, we unpick some of the complexities, the challenges, and the opportunities on the topic of climate resilience with some inspirational thought leaders. Now, the title of this episode is Who's Responsible for Resilience and How Do We Share the Load? And within that, we'll also be looking at the role that creativity and arts can play as an effective engagement tool. Joining me are Steve Scott-Bottoms and Jonathan Moxon. Welcome, chaps. Welcome to the podcast. And maybe we would like to start with some introductions. Steve, how about you?
Hello. Yeah, I'm Steve Scott-Bottoms. I'm a professor of contemporary theatre and performance at the University of Manchester. And I also run a small social enterprise called Vesper Hill, about which we will no doubt say more.
Super. Welcome. And Jonathan?
Yeah, hi there, Phil. I'm Jonathan Moxon. I work for Leeds City Council. I'm the Flood and Climate Resilience Manager there, and I'm also a director for a new company called the Air Resilience Company.
Lovely, which again, we will find out more about as we go on. So some context then for this episode. The government has recently launched a consultation about how we can best distribute government funds for flood resilience and how we can embrace alternative and complementary funding sources. Now, this consultation is getting people all across the sector, not just thinking about how we can fund all of this, but also the wider context of building whole society resilience to climate change. I suppose it's about how we fund the right things at the right time and in the right places. Now, as we've discussed on many previous episodes, what's worked in the past won't necessarily be the solution for the future. We need novel solutions. And talking of novel solutions, Jonathan, let's go back to the Air Resilience Company that you've just mentioned. Maybe you could give us a bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Air Resilience Company has been a project for the last 2-3 years as a side project to the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme. So that's a £200 million, fairly traditional flood scheme in Leeds that has been done in phases, lots of engineering, lots of innovative moving parts that protect the city and provide a 1 in 200 year standard of protection with some allowance for climate change, which is pretty typical. But what we needed to do as well was to work with nature-based solutions and work across the whole catchment. And so to do that, we've needed a different model. And so the extra climate adaptation we need for the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme needs to come through land management changes and NFM, natural flood management. Money for that is difficult to find, and actually revenue money to pay for the upkeep and the repeat activities and the maintenance and the hosting of those measures on private farmland or private land is difficult to find. And so what we've been working on is to create a community interest company that is completely not for profit and puts whatever funding it has into the catchment to work with farmers and land managers to manage the land in a way that does have a tangible reduction in flood risk in Leeds. It has lots of other benefits. The work has lots of benefits around the catchment in different places, but its primary sort of outcome is that we can hydrologically model the impact of those interventions and the impact that it has on Leeds, and we aim to reduce peak flood flows in a very large flood to Leeds by 5%. And to do that, we've created a company so that private businesses that benefit from that flood risk reduction and the climate adaptation that comes with that, they pay into the company so that we've then got the revenue money to pay the farmers and to pay the delivery contractors to do the interventions.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks for that background. And it is novel, and I think there are a lot of people in the sector watching with eager interest to see how it performs and how successful you are. Steve, I'll bring you in at this point then. So you have an involvement and a role with the Air Resilience Company as well through Vesper Hill, don't you?
Yes, or technically through some funding that I got through my university. I'll come to Vesper Hill in a second. We've got some impact acceleration money for anybody who cares what that means, to work alongside, when I say we, I mean myself and a postdoctoral research associate, Milo Harries. We're working alongside Jonathan and his team and the ARC project team. And really, we've been thinking about engagement, because a crucial aspect of the ARC project really is to say, well, we need to generate this revenue, and we want to generate it through kind of contributions from businesses in Leeds. So there's a kind of public-private collaboration going on, which goes to this wider question, as you're saying, Phil, of like who's responsible. And the big question is, well, why would businesses pay into this? And there are kind of good flood modeling reasons for it, and there's maybe good citizenship reasons for it, and so on. But there's also a free rider problem, because if you pay in and the person next door doesn't, and they get the same benefit, then et cetera, et cetera. So there are all kinds of interesting questions around this. So what Milo and I have been trying to do is kind of engage businesses in a kind of a dialogue that's somewhat on the side of the sort of if you like, the sales pitch work that some of Jonathan's colleagues have been doing, just to really understand how people in businesses and Leeds think about climate and flood and their responsibilities for those things. And we've had quite a diversity of responses that have come through the research interviews that Milo's been doing. And then what we've done, because we're also theatre makers, is develop that into a performance piece, which is then designed to further engage audiences, and it's sort of set up. The piece Inundated is staged as a kind of mock business network meeting, so it enables the audience to discuss the issues further as they're kind of put in a slightly playful, more might almost say slightly silly way in the performance itself. So yeah, and the performance is kind of presented by Vesper Hill, which is the name of this social enterprise that I established with my partner, which is really a kind of front end public entity that can do performances, workshops, discussions around resilience issues, future uncertainty, really kind of trying to do some of that social value work, if you like, in terms of getting people to engage with these questions.
Oh, fantastic. And I will say at this point, I had the luxury of watching Inundated. We put it on as a fringe event at Flood and Coast recently. So we hired the back room of a pub, we put some food on, and we had a group of people from across the sector coming, and you put it on, and it was fantastic. It was really warm, witty, engaging, and we'll come on to, I think, the role that creativity and storytelling play as an engagement tool. But just my feedback, Steve, was it's absolutely fantastic, and really does the job of I think articulating what is quite a complicated model for funding in a really accessible way. So congratulations on the work that you and Milo have done on that.
Thank you very much.
Jonathan, then, so obviously you and your team have been having these conversations with businesses in and around Leeds. How receptive are you finding they are to the proposals, the proposition, the context, and the ask, really?
I think the honest answer would be it's really mixed, and I think that's because all businesses are really different, and so even though we've tried to keep the offer of what we're proposing and what the business model is for ARC fairly simple and straightforward, what we've then got to do a lot of the time, this is where, in fairness, as Steve's described, the sort of work that Steve and Milo in particular has done, is they've helped us to sort of reflect on how important it is to listen to businesses, really, rather than go in and just pitch the idea. And I think that's really helped. So where we probably got groups of businesses together in the beginning and talked about the principle and the theory of what we were doing, and everybody was sort of supportive of the idea, but then when we started to talk about a contract or a relationship, maybe they became a little bit less positive because they weren't sure how to proceed. And I think that's one of the major learnings, is that actually this is new and it's an innovative way to engage with businesses, and therefore you're not necessarily plugging into an existing mechanism, or you're not selling to a business that's got ARC or something like ARC in its existing business plan. And so we probably needed to then have that time to do that learning, and to listen back a little bit about what they thought of it. And then we went again and we've talked again, and I think actually there's a real growing level of support for ARC, and I think as well, it helps when certain businesses have provided some leadership in that space, and they are talking to other businesses on our behalf and talking their language. But I think understanding each of those businesses first has helped us to get a better, more positive response. And yeah, the response overall has been brilliant. I think we've gone from this being a concept and a innovation project to actually, this is a bona fide community interest company, and we're going to do this for real, and that feels really exciting.
What
and you're
type of
launching next week, Jonathan, officially?
We are launching officially on Tuesday next week. I'm not sure when this goes out, but that's in the middle of June. So I think, yeah, we're launching in June, and that is the culmination of a lot of work to get to a point where we've got enough confidence that enough businesses are ready to sign a contract and enter into an agreement. There's some complications there in that they're not a hurdle we can't overcome, but what we've had to do is make sure that it's transactional between the people who manage the land and the businesses. So all the businesses are signing up to contracts that commit us to doing work on the land. So therefore, we also need to make sure that we've got all those contracts lined up with the landowners, so we've got enough supply for the demand. But yeah, we launched in June, which is really exciting.
All the very best, and good luck with that. I hope it goes well. And yes, by the time this podcast is available, I think you will have had that launch. So yeah, wishing you all the very, very best success with that. Let's dive in then to the slightly broader topic of the role of creativity and the arts and storytelling, and what they can do as an engagement tool. Now, Steve, we've worked together over the last 3 or 4 years. You were the architect, designer, creator of the pioneering theatrical performance for JBA called The Boxer's Guide to Climate Resilience, which again was a fantastic piece. If you've not seen it, get in touch. We'll be able to arrange something. But why, Steve, do you think the arts and storytelling are so powerful in the context of flooding and climate resilience? What is it?
I mean, that's an excellent, a very, very broad question. I suppose for me, the thing about storytelling of any sort, really, and so I'm primarily a theatre maker, a storyteller in that sense, but this is true of film and of fiction and so on. But a good story, well told, is accessible to anybody, right? And so one of the problems I think that we deal with in flood world, if you will, insofar that I even belong in flood world, thank you guys for letting me in, is that a lot of it is quite technical and a lot of it's quite complicated, and there may be difficulties in communicating with the public around that. And often there are public consultation exercises, but they can be quite dry, and not necessarily very appealing to people. And so, and in fact, in the past, and Jonathan will remember some of this, we've done, theatricalized public engagement exercises to try to kind of make them a bit more fun for people, which worked really interestingly, actually, particularly when we launched the first stage of the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme. I just think it kind of changes the dynamic, and I think it means that so if you're an ordinary member of the public, if you're we've had children engage with this stuff, even, and it's not particularly aimed at children, but an intelligent kid can follow a story, and so people are coming at things from their own place. But also, if you've built the piece right, it may also be that professionals in the sector are kind of learning something new, are kind of seeing things from a different angle because of the way the story's been told. And one of the things that's often come through from feedback for these performances that we've been making is that it's helped people to kind of connect their kind of personal lives and personal values, if you like, with their professional roles, which is, for me, like the best kind of endorsement you could have, that because in the end, storytelling is about who we are as human beings, right? And what we feel and what we think. And so trying to kind of use that to talk about maybe sometimes quite technical issues like, nature-based flood solutions and so on is a challenge, but also I mean, anybody who works in the sector knows how exciting that stuff is. So it should be possible to communicate it, right, in an engaging way.
Mm. And what you were describing there, Steve, is really resonating with me, because we've done quite a bit actually in JBA over the last few years, where we've engaged with different artists in different contexts, and it's always been about taking the rational, the empirical, the data that we use, which, as you rightly refer to, is very complex. You know, we're dealing with climate science, climatic data, but also using then the arts and creativity to enable a conversation that uses emotion and sentiment, as well as the power of data. So I think it's really powerful to combine the two. Jonathan, bring you in here. You've obviously worked with Steve in the past, and you saw the potential for the inundated piece as a means of communicating around the arc. How beneficial have you found it? Any feedback so far? What are the benefits to you and the project?
I think there's a few things come out of this, and like Steve said, we've worked in a few on a few projects, or in a few different ways over the last few years, and I always find that it's a really useful way to hold a bit of a mirror up to yourself as a sort of industry professional, where Steve's very good, and Milo's got the same skills. They're really good at properly listening, and they play it back to you really well, so that it allows you to sort of do that reflection piece around, actually, what I think I'm saying to people, they're not necessarily hearing it in the same way I intended it or I wanted them to hear it, and therefore it helps you to sort of reflect on that it's about how you say things, and it's about how it's presented rather than just the content, just picking up on what you've just said. And that's been really true for ARC. I think we've had some really tangible impacts on the project where we've literally changed the phrasing, the timing, the focus of what we've done to create the company has changed directly as a result of the feedback and the sort of links that Steve and Milo have made, because they've gone and spoken to people properly and listened and fed that back, and they've got this really good sort of feedback loop around listening and seeing what emerges from that, and then sort of taking that action and putting that back into the mix and starting again. And I think that's been really good for the project, because we could have gone down a really technical route, or we could have gone down quite a hard-nosed business negotiation route, and we haven't. We've softened our approach in terms of being much more about listening and engagement. And I think the inundated piece in particular is brilliant, because it plays back actual interviews. It's real people's interpretations and stories and experiences, and it puts it in the context of ARC. And it's not selling ARC. What it's just doing is explaining a situation from real life experiences and giving people an opportunity to think about that for themselves and put themselves in that story, and so that they can relate to it, which is loads better. I feel we've had a better result when people have engaged with it like that than when we just give them facts and figures. That they sort of become more involved in the vision and the story and the purpose of it. And I think maybe the climate resilience agenda needs that, because we need to get people to feel passionately about it and want to do something about it, even if it's only small. And I think taking climate resilience actions and adaptation is challenging for lots of people, because they don't know what to do and where to do it. But if you're passionate about something, then you're more willing to take a step into it. So yeah, I think we've had some really specific and tangible outcomes from Steve's work.
If I can come in there, I think it's quite, I mean, it's very, very kind of you to say all that, Jonathan. I think what I would point out based on that is that this kind of work, this arts-based engagement work, is not just about making the play or making the kind of artistic outcome, if you like, because that kind of gives us a nice thing to work towards. But even then, when you've made it, you're playing it back and you're using it again to kind of get further conversations going. So Inundated is shaped in the framework of a kind of business network meeting, as I said, and it's in 3 parts. And part 3 is where the audience pretend to be members of this network and have a debate about what we've been talking about in part 2, and so on. So and that kind of mimics really the framework that Jonathan was just describing of listening, seeing what's emerging from those conversations, taking action, and then feedback. Milo calls this LEAF, listening, emergence, action, feedback, which is a really useful way of articulating the model, I think. And we're doing that through the whole process of interviewing, talking to people, sitting in conversations, and so on and so forth. And again, yeah, that. So almost regardless of making the play, those kinds of improvisatory skills that go into that process are making a difference, we hope. And as Jonathan has just said there, and I know that when we made the Boxer's Guide for JBA, the kind of objective there initially was to interview a kind of cross-section of JBA staff confidentially, understand the extent to which they understood the JBA climate resilience model: aware, adapt, respond, recover, and then feedback our kind of key findings from that to the directors team. And that again apparently had some really kind of valuable outcomes in terms of, you know, the sort of senior leadership, if you like, understanding, you know, how the staff understood the model, you know. So yeah, so it's a real kind of, it's a whole process, not just a kind of a nice shiny thing, if you like. And that's, you know, in the arts, in universities in particular, we sometimes get people in other fields, you know, like social sciences or whatever, and they'll come and go, look, we've done this great research, will you now dress it up for us so we can show it to the public? And my response is always, well, that's not really what we do, because actually arts research is an entire thing from start to finish. You know, we don't just we're not just an add-on, if you like, you know.
Yeah. No, really interesting to hear about, as you say, the process, the end product, and also, Jonathan, your experiences of just seeing this firsthand and seeing how, you know, receptive businesses and people have been. Jonathan, in the Inundated piece, Steve talks about distributed or collective responsibility. And we've had conversations about this on previous episodes of the podcast. I know episode 9, we had Carl Asprey on and Toby Jones from JBA, and we spoke at length about whole society. Now, this episode is, as I say, entitled "Who's Responsible for Resilience and How Do We Share the Load?" So, Jonathan, final sort of 10 minutes or so of question, really. So, why is distributed involvement and shared responsibility important then in building whole society resilience to climate change?
Again, that's a good question, Phil. That's a big one, really. And I suppose I think the short answer that I'll build on is it has to be. And I think that's because the model for sort of almost like single issue funding or single issue solutions and projects isn't really going to crack the nut. And therefore, we do have to reach past the point where everybody can stand back and think, well, that's technically not my job. And I think climate resilience sits outside of that for me, in that it affects so many different things in different ways, that it isn't a sole organization, certainly not an individual's job in a place to make a place more climate resilient. And that's partly because sometimes the answer is about action and intervention and infrastructure or whatever it might be. But a lot of the time it's about behaviors as well. And it's about a collective responsibility for, you know, the things that are contributing to a changing climate, but then also the things that mean that we recognize that a change has to happen. And so, you know, that therefore most of those things that we would need to do are either actions we have to think about as individuals, or lots of different organizations also have a role to play in that. And I think part of the work that I've done with Steve previously was around, it came out of, or who do we need to speak to at Leeds City Council about climate change? And there was probably like 2 names that came up, and I was one of them. And the reality is that's a really bad answer, because actually every function across a local authority will be affected or could affect how climate resilient Leeds is. And therefore, but that's not sort of where we start from normally. But it's absolutely true. You know, the activities that you do, the services that you provide, the decisions that you make, the funding that you put into things, all of those have a bearing on this. And therefore, we do need to sort of have that sort of cross-service approach or cross-organisation approach, and be that, you know, whether that's us as an employee or us as a citizen. And I think when we've been doing our resilience company, one of the initial questions would be, well, why is the public purse just not paying for this? Or why do I pay for it and my neighbour doesn't? And they're really good questions. But I think what's come out of it is that, well, actually, if we all think like that, we're all going to be in quite a bad situation, really, because there isn't a policy waiting in the wings to come and solve this, and there's not a pot of funding that works in a way that we need it to solve all these issues. So therefore, there are a range of things we all need to be able to do, and obviously there'll be different things for different people, and us taking an opportunity to reflect on what that should be for us is really important. So yeah, I think what's coming out of it is that the single issue approach and siloed thinking isn't going to work, because it isn't any one person or one organisation's responsibility. It's a broader thing, and we need to think of ways of getting people to engage with that.
I was waiting for the silo word to crop up there. It happened. It occurs probably on every podcast that we've recorded. So yeah, I think I think you're absolutely right, Jonathan. It is. We do need to break down those silos, and climate resilience, by its very nature, is, as you say, cross and multi-sector. Steve, I'd really be interested in your views on that same question, really, in terms of why collective involvement and shared responsibility is important. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on it from the work that you've done.
I mean, I have all sorts of thoughts. I think as Jonathan is speaking, the thing I'm thinking of is the prisoner's dilemma, which your listeners may be familiar with from game theory and so on, which is that model which is a non-zero sum game, right? So traditionally games are played zero-sum games. There's a winner, there's a loser. A non-zero sum game is where you both act independently, and depending on what the other person does, whatever you do might or might not turn out well, right? And so and there's a psychologist whose work is really interesting to me, Morton Deutsch, who did a lot of work with this kind of game theory model, and basically pointed out that there is actually a rational way to play a non-zero sum game if you have a basis for trusting the other player, right? And so what it all comes down to is, how do you build trust with people in the sector, across the sector, with businesses, with local communities, and so on and so forth. And that takes time, and it's not easy. And I think the arts can be a tool in that. But it's really important, you know, if we talk about distributed responsibility, for example, one of the immediate kind of red flags that throws up is that just government trying to make homeowners responsible for their own flood risk rather than doing whatever needs to be done. But of course, we also know that homeowners do need to take some responsibility, because the government can't just flood defend every home in the country, right? So there is a kind of a sense that we're all in this together, and we all have our own roles to play. And it's about people understanding that and doing what they can in their own context, their own communities, and so on. And resilience, I mean, at community level, is really about people knowing their neighbours and looking out for each other, you know, fundamentally. Yeah. So, and that also is something that we've kind of played with in previous projects.
Super. Guys, that's been a really fascinating conversation. Genuinely, thank you so much for taking some time out and joining the podcast this afternoon. It's been really fantastic. And so we've reached the end of our time today. As always, if you have enjoyed listening, then please hit the subscribe button so you're ready for our next episode in a month's time. Till then, thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Emonson, and you've been listening to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting.